Hello Horus Heresy fans, welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Night Lords, the 8th Legion. We're going to be talking about all of their special units, special abilities, special equipment, and we're also going to be talking about the tactics you can use on the tabletop and the armies you can build for your games of Horus Heresy, Age of Darkness. So let's get to it, and we're going to start with the Night Lords Legion trait. So, this is called a Talent for Murder, and what it does is it gives you +1 to wound when you're targeting a unit that is pinned, or that is currently fallen back, or that you outnumber. And this works in both shooting and melee as well. So this is a really good ability because quite uniquely across the abilities for Space Marine Legions, it gives you bonuses in both melee and shooting as well, but the drawback is obviously that it's conditional, that it doesn't always work. But it does play to the existing strengths of the Legion, because those things, pinning, failing morale checks, etc., are what Night Lords are trying to do to people anyway, because they use the fear trait quite a lot, so they want to do those things, and when they succeed in doing those things, they obviously get a bonus doing it. It also does mean that you've got some emphasis on larger units as well. So instead of having to pin something, or instead of having to make something fall back, you can just have a bigger unit than the other person, which you can often do by having, unit to 20 tactical marines, or this uses the bulky rule counts for this as well. So a unit of 5 Terminators will count as 10 men for this as well. So you can have large unit of Terminators, maybe 10 Terminators would count as 20, that kind of stuff too. Dreadnoughts count as 1 for this, interestingly enough. So vehicles count as 10, that's part of the rule, but dreadnoughts count as 1, and presumably other things that don't have the bulky rule, like automata and that kind of stuff, are also going to count as well as 1 as well. So what's good about this rule actually is that it's quite easy to get your +1 to wound versus things like dreadnoughts as well, which are actually quite popular units too. Also quite easy to get your +1 against elite size units, so things like veterans that come in smaller squad sizes but slightly more powerful models, like 2 wounds each but don't have the bulky rule. Quite easy for you to get your bonuses against them too. So overall, a really easy and thematic way to get bonuses to both your melee and shooting with your Night Lords army. And when you build these Night Lords armies, you're really going to lean into this as a way of getting them bonuses. And +1 to wound is also quite a powerful bonus as well. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is their advanced reaction. So this is called the Better Part of Valor. Quite funnily, a little bit of a joke there. So when you charge a Night Lords unit once a game, they can react doing this, and what they do is they fall back. So you don't have any control over the distance you're going to fall back. You obviously just do a normal fall back roll, you roll your dice, you move that far away. Now once the opponent has declared the charge, they can't undeclare it. So if you're still within 12 inches, the opponent has to charge you. So that means that they can be forced into a poor position with a surge move potentially if they don't charge you. So let's say someone's 5 inches away, you fall back 7, you're still within 12, the opponent's still got to charge you. They're probably going to fail, but they have to move forward. So you've wasted that unit's charge that turn really, and potentially put them somewhere they really don't want to be, like maybe now standing out in the open, standing out of cover, standing in front of your army. You can charge them back in your turn, or shoot them, or just ignore them, and whatever you want to do. They can redirect their charge after this, so if you've got another unit nearby, they can charge them instead. So, you might want to spread your units out so they can't do that. Alternatively, if the other unit nearby is just a really strong combat unit and they accidentally charge your combat unit, that's a thing too. Now, they do get to choose whether to redirect the charge by the wording of this, so they're not going to do that unless it's maybe they make a mistake. But, it is an option. You can just make sure the only things they can charge alternately could be your combat unit, which may also mean they just don't charge at all. So quite a good reaction, this one. Really good for getting one of your units out of dodge, particularly if it's a unit that you've had to position a little bit far forward to use its fear or something like that, so it gets you, the ability to keep that unit safe as well. So again, really works well with the way you want to play the army, and again is very thematic of the Night Lords. We love thematic rules. Thematic rules are so good. It's great when you get to play the army the way it should feel as well. So speaking of that, let's talk about the Warlord traits too. So all 3 of these Warlord traits are good, and they're all very definitely playable. So the first is Warmonger, which is traitors only. So you get +1 to hit for the Warlord and his entire unit when targeting enemy units that include an independent character. Now that's for shooting and melee as well. Now this is pretty good really, because a lot of units will include independent characters just because all the different types of consoles are so good, and there's always going to be at least one unit on the battlefield that does, for the most part. So that's quite a good bonus, whether it's melee or shooting. You can easily be on +1 to hit and also +1 to wound from the Legion trait, which is really good. Also a little side benefit, if you're in an army where you've got a detachment of Sons of Horus as well, the Warlord and his unit also gain Fearless. That's more of a thematic bonus. You're probably not going to do that just to get this, and you might not even collect Sons of Horus as well. But this is just the Warlord really trying to impress Horus by making sure he doesn't run away, which is kind of cool. And you get a reaction in the shooting phase for this Warlord trait as well, which is one of the best kinds. We've also got Jadek Clanlord. Now that gives you counterattack 1, and you ignore all your penalties to movement and charge rolls due to terrain, and you can reroll failed dangerous terrain tests. So a very mobile unit and very mobile style Warlord trait. Gives you an extra reaction in movement phase as well to reinforce that theme. Now this one's a must take in one of the Rites of War as well. So for the biker gang Rite of War, which we'll talk about later, on its own is a good trait. Maybe not quite as good as Warmonger generally, or as good as Flamemaster that we're going to talk about now. So Flamemaster gives you the Fear 1 special rule, which is okay, but there's so many ways to get Fear 1 in the army, it's maybe not super fabulous bonus. Whenever you are part of a combat that results in all enemy units being destroyed, whether that's because you destroy them all or you sweep them, though, your Fear value goes up by 1, which is strong, because Fear doesn't stack, so you only ever use the highest Fear number. And as soon as Fear starts going above 1, you start putting most units on like a average fail whenever they have to take any kind of morale test. You assume a Space Marine unit's normally leadership 8. If there's Fear 2 nearby, odds on it's going to fail most morale tests. So Fear 2 is quite a big deal compared to Fear 1, although there's lots of different ways to do this to get people's leadership down, but this is just really good, and that can go all the way up to 3, and it gives you an assault phase reaction as well. So this is my favourite trait, I think. I think it's the most exciting for me as well, because +1 to hit from Warmonger, sure, that's cool, but +1 to Fear just feels more Night Lordy to me, and Flamemaster's also got the coolest name as well. So I think that's the one that I would be going with most of the time. Let's also look at their equipment now. I really like the Night Lord's equipment. It's really good. So to start, they've got Nostrum and chain weapons. So the chain weapons are all really good. So a lot of the weapons that you get with some legions are like side grades or slightly different versions of weapons, and in a lot of cases they're actually just worse than the normal versions. But the Nostrum and chain weapons are actually all upgrades. They're very good. The downside is you do pay for it, they are expensive. So the Chain Blade is basically an upgrade of Power Swords with +1 strength, AP 3, Shred, and Breaching 6. It's Breaching, not Rending, so you do lose out on potential D3 extra armor pen. You also lose out on the auto wound, but with Strength 5 and the targets you're going to be going after, realistically, that's not really a big downside. So pretty much it's a Power Sword with Shred and +1 strength, and for that, you will pay 10 points. Which is good. Equipping a whole unit with them will get very expensive very fast, but as an option for characters, it's pretty good. You can't actually equip units with these anyway. Some units can use them. Chainglaive is also good. It's +2 strength, but it's two-handed, so you give up maybe 1 attack for an extra point of strength. That will normally put you onto wounded on 2s though, so that's good as well. And then finally we got the Headman's Axe. This is really good. This is ×2 strength, so it's going to instant death most things. It's also Shred. It's Breaching 6 and it's two-handed, AP 3. It's not unwieldy, importantly, so this is +15 points generally, but this is really good just because it's such high strength. It's going to instant death things, but it's only AP 3. So a bit of a, tough one to call that. You want the instant death, but a lot of things that you want to instant death have got a 2+ armor save. So is this really good enough for that? But then it's got Shred. So the good thing about Shred and all these breaching weapons is that when you do fail to wound, you've got another chance of hitting the breach as well. So that's kind of a good thing too. So these are already good weapons anyway. I really like all of them. I definitely think they're a good thing for Night Lords to have access to. We've also got the Eschaton Power Claw, which is a super power fist, effectively. So it's a power fist in all regards, except it's also got shred. You can see a theme going on here. It's a specialist weapon, and it's also Murderous Strike 6. And Murderous Strike may be a little bit redundant, just because it's going to be strength 8 a lot of the time and instant death things anyway, but does help sometimes, and it does help take down things like Dreadnoughts, where it will do extra damage. So this is a pretty good weapon. It's an extra 10 points. It does mean that you're pretty much auto-wounded most things, because strength 8 shred means you're mostly going to be wounded on 2s with a reroll if you are hitting the aforementioned Dreadnoughts, which is always a thing we're talking about because Dreadnoughts are super popular. Strength 8 will normally wound Dreadnoughts on a 3, and you are going to get to reroll that as well, and you might hit that Murderous Strike for a D3 damage. So I think this is really good, particularly if you want to have something in your army that's going to be ready to kill those slightly tougher targets when you're getting up close. Then we've got some special rules as well in the armory. So Lords of Murder. This is an independent character can take this for 5 points as long as they're not unique. When a unit composed entirely of models with this special rule declares a charge target unit that's pinned or fallen back, you get +1 extra to charge, and if you do charge, then you get +1 attack on the charging unit for the rest of the turn. Now, I think this is really good. I think you probably take this on most characters for 5 points, just for that potential bursting out of a unit, getting +1 to charge, getting an extra attack when you can use it. It's 5 points. It's so cheap. But there are some units that get this as well, which makes it even better at that point. There's also Prey Sight as well. This is 15 points for any Night Lords unit, including vehicles, dreadnoughts, anything whatsoever, and it gives them night fighting. Now that's really good because night fighting gives -1 leadership to everything on the battlefield and limits shooting to 24 inches as well. And it's in 5 out of the 6 scenarios in the book, night fighting too. So you will be playing night fighting quite a lot, depending on whether you go into a narrative event with slightly different rules or something maybe, but you'll be playing night fighting quite a lot. So 15 points to be able to ignore it means you can always choose to fight at night, and that's another 1 leadership penalty that's going to stack up with your fear to play into all the Night Lords rules, and you're going to ignore it as well. So also that 24-inch range thing going on there too. You know, you can have a whole army set up ready to take advantage of night fighting, and you've got 1, maybe 2, or with one of the Rites of Wars, maybe 3 turns where you just got like an army-wide benefit that the other person may not be set up to deal with. So this is a really good thing. It's very thematic, and it's a really interesting way to build your army as well, to take advantage of this. Lastly, they've got Trophies of Judgment. So any character can be given the Fear 1 special rule for 10 points, so including sergeants, that kind of stuff. This is really good. Just means that you've got the ability to turn any unit in your army, you know, whether it's a special Night Lords unit or not, into a fear-bearing unit. So tactical squads, maybe assault squads, maybe bikes or jet bikes or something like that. Whatever you decide to use in your army can always be carrying that fear around the battlefield. And one of the things you definitely do want to do with Night Lords is make sure you've got enough fear on the battlefield that ideally everything is affected by it all the time. You know, whenever you make someone make any check, you want them to always be at that -1 for their fear, because that's how you start winning that, you know, attrition battle and really starting to leverage your special rules over the course of the game. So you really want to have this in as many places as you can, and having such easy access to it for a cheap cost is really good. Okay, so everyone's favourite part, the units. So let's go on to that. So first of all, we've got the Terror Squad. So this is a 115-point unit, and this is 5 guys with 1 wound each. Now, from the outset, that's quite expensive. That's more than double the cost of a tactical marine for a 1 wound guy. So these are a little bit squishy inherently. They are 2 attacks each though, and they are +1 leadership compared to normal marines as well. The secret here is in their special rules. So they cause fear, 1. They've got Precision Strike 6, and they've also got Infiltrate and the Bloody Murder rule that we just talked about a minute ago. So when they charge something that's pinned or fallen back, they get an extra attack. They've also got Preferred Enemy Infantry. So these are like assassins in a lot of ways. So although they are not very good at taking a punch, they do have the skirmish unit type as well, so they get +1 to their cover saves and they can spread out a little bit more for coherency. So when they charge, these are potentially 5 attacks each with their chainswords, so 2 base, +1 for charging, +1 for 2 weapons, +1 for bloody murder as well. They're also precision strikes, so even if you might not kill lots of stuff in the enemy unit, there's a good chance of getting the important things in the enemy unit, and the preferred enemy as well, so they're getting some rerolls when they charge. You can give them some interesting stuff, so you can give them chain blades, chain glaives, or chain axes. So you've got lots of ways you can make them better if you want to, although again, quite expensive. 10 points for the first 2 of those on a unit that's quite easy to kill. You can also give them guns as well, so you can give them rotor cannons, which is a great option. So 5 points each. They can take rotor cannons, so you're going to be, and they're assault weapons as well. So you can take the rotor cannons, you can potentially pin something because it's got shell shock 1 plus your fear, so it's 2 leadership off whatever you're shooting as well. These are really interesting. What makes them work is they've obviously got infiltrate. They can also take a drop pod or a Dreadclaw drop pod by default as well. So you could take a bunch of these with rotor cannons, drop them down with the drop pod, open up on something, have a fair chance of pinning it and do some damage. You could also then potentially charge as well, because even without upgrades to weapons, they're pretty good at just killing, basic power armored Marines. Or you could, have a couple of them with some chain weapons and a couple with rotor cannons as well, and it gives you a slightly more interesting varied unit. You can also put big power weapons on the Sergeant as well. These are a really cool unit. They do a lot. They are quite expensive and they're very fragile, and you can certainly expect them not to last very long once they hit the ground. But they are quite a good first strike unit because offensively they're quite good. They've got a lot of rules, they've got a lot of rerolls, they've got a lot of attacks, they've got access to some good weapons. And they will look quite cool on the battlefield because they're quite good with that variety too. And as you can see in the picture, they're really just heads. So if you've got a unit of Marines, you can have them with some nice mixed and matched weapons, some melee weapons, maybe some rotor cannons. 2 rotor cannons is normally enough to force a pinning test on a unit, particularly if you're getting your +1 to wound from being Night Lords as well. 2 rotor cannons we normally do, and you can charge in and have some melee shenanigans as well. So these are a little bit expensive, are quite fragile for what they do, but they certainly have an interesting use, and they're definitely very, very Night Lords. Next we've got Night Raptors. So on the flip side, these guys are, well, they're also very expensive, but these are real elites. So the weapon skill 5, 2 wounds, 2 attacks base. They've also got that skirmish trait. Now these have got sudden strike 1, so they're +1 initiative when they charge. They've also got that bloody murder rule. They've got fear as well. They come with night vision built in, and they've also got jump packs. Now they're 185 points, so again, quite squishy really for their points. 185 for 5-2 wound guys with just power armor is quite easy to kill, but they're very offense oriented, much like the Terror Squad. So they can take chain blades, chain glaives, lightning claws, power weapons. They can also take 1 special weapon in the unit if you're that way inclined as well. But really what you want to do with these guys obviously is be charging them into combat and make sure you've got a mix of weapons in the unit, enough of those nice chain weapons to make sure you do lots of damage when you charge. A few guys without many upgrades, because undoubtedly some of them will die on the way in, and you probably want to add a few extra models to this unit as well, so it's not just 5 guys jumping around. But again, when they do charge, 2 weapons, bloody murder potentially in there as well, +1 to wound potentially from the Night Lord's trait. They're really strong. They've got an awful lot going for them there, and they're very fast because they've got the jump packs as well. It also means that they can deep strike if that's a thing you want. You deep strike them down, you get the fear and everything. Even if they're not getting the charge in straight away, you can plonk some fear where you want it as well. So these are also a really cool unit. What you can see emerging from this already with the Terror Squads and the Night Raptors is they're expensive, they're very good offensively, less good defensively. That kind of works with the theme of the army, because between night fighting, potential limiting shooting, and pinning lots of enemy units so they can't do anything to you back, what you really want to do is be using these highly offensive units to kill stuff and using your ability to pin things with the rest of your army to hopefully reduce the amount of fire and return charges that your guys are taking while they're running around the enemy ranks, killing them every turn. So these are a really cool unit, but obviously you have to support them to stop them just getting killed. Next we got the Contekar Terminator squad. I really like these. Again, weapon skill 5 Terminators, 2 wounds, your standard stubborn rule. Now they're also fear 1. They also get the deep strike rule, which obviously most Terminators in Horus Heresy don't. They've also got the Lords of the Night rule, which lets them be a HQ choice if you want them to as well. So these guys were sent in to stop the squabbling Night Lords and actually just go and lead people when they needed to too, which is interesting. Now weapons wise, they come with that chain blade, so they've got that enhanced power sword. They can take Eschaton Power Claw on the leader, and they also come with Volkite Cavities, which are interesting. So it's heavy 4, only a 10-inch range though, strength 6, AP 5, definitely great. So a really good weapon for killing troops, but quite close range as well. Now these are also Tartaros armor as well, not Cataphractii armor. So their weapons are not the most powerful Terminator weapons, and against other Terminators these are not going to do that well because they can't penetrate armor. But again, for killing troops, like most of the other special units we've seen, these are very good, and their guns are very good as well. And they're only 225 points, so 225 points for a weapon skill 5 Terminator unit that's basically fully kitted out with way better than average guns, as well as effectively slightly upgraded power weapons is still pretty good. These guys look really cool. They're a really interesting unit, and again, they come with deep strike, so they do a lot. Even though they're not good at killing Terminators, they do a lot, and these are also a great unit to take in your army. Next we got the characters, so there's just 2 for Night Lord. So Sevetar is certainly one of the higher end of unique characters in terms of stats, so he's quite powerful. He's weapon skill 7, he's good. One of the best things about him, I think, is he's got fear 2. Once fear goes up to 2, as I mentioned with the Warlord traits before, it really starts to become problematic for your enemy. So he's really good for that reason alone, but he's also just a super powerful character. You know, he's got preferred enemy, or rather he grants preferred enemy to your Terminator units, including the Kontekars when they turn up. So them Kontekars drop down with their Volkite Cavities and then immediately get those special rules, which is really powerful. They get those rerolls with those Volkite weapons. He's just generally good. He also gets instant death when he's fighting against things that have got weapon skill 5 or more in a challenge. So his weapon is pretty decent, but not incredible. But it's always instant death as well, like in challenges, which makes him quite good for fighting challenges too. And he's also got all those rules. He's got bloody murder. He's got precision strikes 4 if he is fighting a unit. I mean, he's probably going to beat most units he fights anyway, so he probably doesn't need it, but that's also good. So he's just generally a powerful character, and 220 points, he's certainly a good investment. And then lastly, we've got the man himself, Konrad Kurze. So 450 points. He's weapon skill 8 Primarch. He's got relatively average Primarch stats. His weapons aren't too amazing, so they're AP2 and shred, but he's only striking at his basic strength. They're murderous strike 4, but they're not always instant death. So as Primarch weapons go, quite weak, although he does have 8 attacks because he's got 2 weapons, and he also is probably going to get another attack if he uses his psychic power, so that goes off on a 7 or less. His psychic power is a glimpse in the future, which is obviously the thing he was cursed with. It gives him an extra attack and feel no pain 4+, which does make him very tough when he's got that feel no pain as well. So he can be up to 9 attacks, which is a lot of attacks even for a Primarch. But again, the main thing, despite the fact that he's certainly not the best, well, the main 2 things. One is if he wipes a unit out in combat, or he sweeps them, everything that can see that combat has to make a pinning test. Now that's very good, because although Night Lords are great at making people fail tests, they don't particularly have any ways more than any other army can include to make people take tests. So this ability to make the whole enemy army potentially suddenly take a pinning test is really good and really plays to Night Lord's strengths. He's also got Fear 3. So as I've mentioned a few times, as Fear gets bigger and bigger, it gets really good. Fear 3 is huge. That means that, you know, your average Space Marine unit, if it's got no buffs, is needing a 5 or less to pass its pinning test. And even a unit that's being buffed by being joined by a leadership 10 character like a Praetor for example, is only passing its test on averages. Something that's being led by a Centurion with Leadership 9 is still going to fail on average. So Fear 3 is just absolutely huge. And I think, as a rule, he's quite, well, in general, he's a little bit on the weak side for a Primarch in terms of raw stats. But most Primarchs, although they have good army-wide buffs, most Primarchs are only dealing with like one target at a time. They're going to kill it most of the time, but they're only dealing with one thing at a time. Whereas Konrad has got Fear 3 and this massive sort of pinning explosion whenever he kills anything. He does also give his whole army night vision and bloody murder, so he saves you some points in investing in those things that, you know, I said before were effectively, to me, like something you want to take an awful lot of, you know? So you might be spending 90 points on night vision in an army ordinarily, and he's going to save you that as well. So I think he's really good. I actually think I would rate him in probably one of the top few Primarchs by like impact he has on the battlefield. You know, not necessarily in Primarch v Primarch combat, but that's not the only thing that happens when you take a Primarch right. So I think he's very, very good. For Rites of War, Night Lords have got access to 2, like most people. So the first and probably main one is called Terror Assault. And Terror Assault really almost is like just more Night Lords army rules. This like embodies the way the Night Lords work, and it really plays well with all of the strengths of the army as well. So what this does is it means that you get an extra turn of night fighting. So normally in a night fighting scenario where you would have one turn and then another turn on a 4-up, this means that you get 2 turns and a third turn on a 4-up, which works really well with the ability that Night Lords have to get night vision. And as I mentioned earlier, night fighting works really well for Night Lords because it's another -1 leadership penalty, and when you bring in lots of pinning and things in your army, it's exactly what you want to see. Stacks up with your fear, really good. It also means that your Terror squads and Night Raptor squads can be taken as troops choices, which is really good, because in this army you get limited to only one heavy support slot, which is one of the worst slots to have limited a lot of the time. So because you can take those Terror Assault and Night Raptor squads as troops, that frees up your elite slots to take something that can bring you some guns. So Dreadnoughts, as an example, is a good thing. So this is good as well, I think worth mentioning, because the way games of Warhammer work is that earlier turns tend to be more happens in them, and they're sort of more important in a lot of ways because more of your stuff's on the table. So as the game goes on, the turns, you know, get shorter and shorter, and there's less stuff on the table. So earlier turns are more important. So having extra night fighting on those early turns when there's all to play for in the game is really good. So this is just generally a powerful Rite of War. I think you can't have any Lords of War in it is another limitation. So if you are into, you know, bringing a Fellblade or something like that, you can't do it in this. And you do get the ability to give all of your characters Fear 1 for free as well. So that's also a nice throw-in. Now, you know, a lot of units don't get Fear, and you might normally buy it for 10 points using their trophies. In this Rite of War, you get it for free, which is a nice thing as well. So I think overall, I think this is very good. I think it's an easy thing to base your army around. It's kind of doing what your army wants to do already. The other advantage of this as well is that if you play a scenario where there is no night fighting and you've bought all that stuff for your army, you know, you've bought those visors and that kind of stuff and set your army up to use it, this does mean that night fighting is always in effect as well. So it means that your opponents, you know, you won't suddenly have paid all those points for all that stuff and be playing a scenario with no night fighting either. So this is really good. And I think for the most part, if you're playing, you know, a standard Night Lords list where you want to do all the standard Night Lords stuff, I think you take this as a really good and also a really thematic default Rite of War as well for your army. So the second Rite of War they've got is called the Swift Blade, which is basically a biker gang. So you have to take a Praetor, but then after that you can take up to 4 more Centurions who all can be your Warlord. They all get the Jadek Clanlord Warlord trait, which is the one where you ignore movement penalties and that kind of stuff we talked about before. And in order to slay the Warlord, you have to kill all of them. That's pretty much what it does. It also makes Outriders troops. Kind of annoyingly, it doesn't make them lines, so that's kind of... It would be nice if you'd have your bikes driving around and take an objective. There's a really cool flavour. I've not ever seen a Night Lords biker army. Maybe some of you guys have. I think this is largely a thematic Rite of War, really. I don't think that this adds a lot to the army. You know, if you're going to make a cool biker army, that's awesome, but you're also going to lock yourself out of all those unique units, and you're going to be making a lot less use of a lot of the special rules as well. It would look great on the tabletop, though, so maybe that's one for dedicated Night Lord players to use as a separate army. So now let's go on to what all this means. So what does the army do? What are the characteristics of a Night Lord army? Well, the first thing that springs out to me is that there's so many synergies, and in order to get the most out of your Night Lord's army, there's lots of stuff you need to do. So some legions, you know, like Iron Warriors or Imperial Fists or something like that, you rarely get your bonuses during army creation. You know, everything gets +1 to hit with its bolters or +1 to armor penetrate vehicles. You're kind of locked in, and your strategy's kind of there, and you've put it in play in army creation. Whereas Night Lords, to get the benefits of this army, it's all about your choices. It's where you put your fear causing units. It's what you choose to use your pinning attacks on and all that kind of stuff. And there's loads of interesting stuff going on, which I think makes this a really interesting army to play. I also think it makes it a really powerful army to play as well. I think you've got lots of options for what to do at any point in the game, and you've got lots of ways to make all those things work. It definitely favours at least some of your units being close. So Fear's got a 12-inch range and it doesn't stack, but you want to try and make sure at least all the units you expect to take tests in the next turn are going to have a fear effect on them. So at least some of your units are going to have to be up close, and obviously the special units are melee units or short range units for the most part anyway, so that's fine. The characters want to be in melee, so that's fine. But this army does buff range weapons as well, which is such a cool and a great thing. So the army does do combined arms well. So you don't need to shove everything up in your opponent's face. You just need to make sure you've got enough to be giving those penalties out, and then you can give them some fire support as well, which will hopefully get those bonuses too. The army is also going to control the enemy through pinning and using their fear ability as well. So what we did say earlier about the Night Lord special units is they're not particularly tough for their points, particularly the Terror Squad and the Raptors. They're actually kind of squishy and they're quite expensive, but they are also very good. And one of the ways you can make them work is by making sure you pin lots of enemy units, which is what the army does really. So making sure using that, and also then using night fighting in the first couple of turns as well to really minimize the enemy's effectiveness, so that your offensive stuff can go to work properly. And then finally, because you can get your buffs via unit size rather than just pinning and morale, that's certainly a thing that you should take into account when making your armies. So, 20 tactical marines is obviously the thing that springs to mind here. But also as well, if you're going to take a unit of Contekar Terminators, maybe you want to take 6 of them instead of 5, because with bulky that means they're a 12-man unit, which means they will be bigger than most default unit sizes. If you're going to take tactical marines, maybe you want to put an 11th model in there. If you're not going to make it a lot bigger, at least make it a little bit bigger so you can get those bonuses against the units most people do generally take as well. And also, as I mentioned earlier, this is an easy way to get bonuses against things like dreadnoughts and robots that come in very small unit sizes. So if you are taking some heavy support weapons or some las cannons and things to deal with those big things, it's just a nice easy way to get that buff as well. So talking about advantages specifically, they're great at making people fail leadership tests when they take them. That's obviously what we do with fear and what we also do with night fighting. And pinning and night fighting can really limit your enemy's effectiveness, especially if they're a shooting army. They're very good at killing 3+ saves in melee. So most of their special weapons, most of the stuff they've got on their special units are all AP3. And they're really good at cleaving their way through save 3 units, because they've also tend to have a lot of attacks because of bloody murder, and a lot of those weapons are one-handed, so they can get extra bonuses for having 2 weapons. They're really good at chopping through lots of enemy space marines. And another advantage is getting +1 to wound dreadnoughts at range as well. This is kind of like Iron Warrior's whole thing, is getting +1 to wound against vehicles effectively with +1 armor pen, +1 strength rather. But, Night Lords also get that pretty much very easily, which is a great thing to have access to with how popular and how good dreadnoughts are. But for disadvantages, you are forced to be quite close to use fear, which could expose your units. So when you pod them units in, or when you infiltrate those units, or whatever you do to try and get your fear onto the enemy units, they are going to be a little bit exposed. And as we've mentioned, they are not that tough. And if you particularly do that on turn 1 and then your opponent goes first, those units could easily die before they get to do anything. Also, as well, the special units in this army are not great at dealing with 2+ saves. So again, all those chain weapons got AP3. Not very good at dealing with enemy Terminators. Enemy Terminators will beat you in a combat a lot of the time. So you're going to have to find other ways to deal with 2+ saves rather than just, your elite units fighting it out with them. The best Rite of War limits your heavy support slot, so that is certainly a limitation. Luckily, you can get around it by things in other support slots to bring you some guns. Vehicles and dreadnoughts don't scare easily. That's another limitation of this army. And if your opponent does bring a lot of vehicles and dreadnoughts, a lot of what this army does is affect infantry, really. So we're still maybe going to get the bonus to wound and dreadnoughts with our guns and stuff like that. But thinking about all the pinning that we're going to bring in the army to make use of the army's advantages, if you play against someone bringing like an armoured spearhead or a March of the Ancients or just an army that's very heavy on bigger things, you actually might find that your army, a lot of what you built it to do doesn't really work. And there's not really anything you can do about that, really, other than make sure you've got enough guns to compensate for it. Some enemies as well, so fearless enemies, leadership 10 enemies, people with augury scanners can remove or mitigate some of your advantages as well. So very high leadership units, if there's enough of them, if you play against someone who's got like 2 banners in their army, so everything's leadership 10, they're not going to fail many pinning tests. Or if you've paid all those points for night fighting, if the other person's brought some augury scanners, you might be relying on that night fighting to make sure that you can, get to combat a bit more safely, whereas the person who's brought the augury scanners is going to ignore that and might just do too much damage to you because you've lost that defense. So some people might be prepared for your thing, and if they're well equipped to counter it, which they can do just by buying some equipment in most cases, you might find you have a harder game. So how do we create an effective force with Night Lords then from all these things? Well, not every unit in your army needs fear, but it is a good idea to have good coverage of the battlefield. So probably all your units that are going into melee, you want to make sure that they've got fear. And if you've got some, stuff in the backfield, like if you've got some units of heavy weapon squads or something like that, you don't need to buy fear causing abilities for all of those, but maybe a couple of the squads in the backfield you might want to have fear. So if the opponent's going to deep strike stuff against you, or if they jump a unit and jetpack stuff towards you to come into melee or something like that, make sure you've got that -1 fear buff on things that are attacking you as well, so that when you try to pin them with your rotor cannons or something to stop them hurting your units, you have got that -1 leadership. So good coverage of fear around your army without going over the top and giving it to everything. And you do need ways to force pinning checks as well. So whilst fear is really good, and a lot of the stuff in the army has it, there's no natural ways to actually make people take pinning tests. And obviously, making people take morale tests just requires killing things. So you do want to make sure you've got a way to force those pinning tests. Now, rotor cannons are just really good for this. So their assault, they've got 4 shots. So their assault, so they can go on your units that might otherwise be going into combat. They cause a pinning test. They've got shell shock 1, which stacks with your fear. So even better. Against the unit of Space Marines, generally, because they're only strength 3, if you're getting your +1 to wound from your army bonus, you'll need 2 rotor cannons to force a pinning test, because you've got to do at least 1 unsaved wound as well. So they're a really good thing to bring, but just anything that brings pinning tests is good. So you've also got some Volkite weapons. You've got the Volkite Cardinal on the new Kratos. You've got the Volkite Falconet on the Deredio Dreadnought. Any of these things that bring pinning, particularly if they can force multiple pinning checks, or if you can force multiple pinning checks, is the thing you want to make use of all the stuff we've been talking about throughout this video. Other things you can bring as well, snipers or seekers are really good. So these sniper weapons on Nemesis Bolters, for example, or on the Vigilator, force a pinning check, so we do want that anyway. But also as well, you can use them to kill sergeants. So if you think about it, if your sniper kills a sergeant, not only have you forced a pinning check, but you've taken a point of leadership off that unit potentially as well, which again plays with what we want to do. And if that unit's affected by fear, if you've killed its sergeant, for most Space Marines, they'll now be leadership 6, and they're probably going to fail the pinning test, which is really good. On that subject as well, Vigilators are even higher value than this. So they are the sniper, they do force the pinning check, and they've got Shell Shock 1 as well. So if a Vigilator kills a sergeant in a unit, that's going to be -1 effective leadership because the sergeant's just died, -1 because you should have fear on that unit, and -1 for the Shell Shock as well. So that's going to be a 5 or less to pass their pinning test, and the Vigilator is going to be pinning people down like nobody's business, which again is super thematic, really, when you think about it. Snipers stacking Shell Shock and fear generally is a good thing. So I mentioned the Vigilator, also the rotor cannons. That's a good way of making sure you get these tests through and make sure that people do get pinned when you're shooting them. Lastly, I think important to mention combined arms again. So this goes for most legions really in the Horus Heresy, so do remember that you get a shooting bonus as well. You probably need to bring something other than your special cool melee units and terror squads to deal with things like dreadnoughts, because they're very tough and fearless, but also to deal with tough melee targets like Terminators. So whether you bring your own characters or maybe a retinue of Terminators with AP2 weapons, or whether you just decide to shoot Terminators with bigger guns, you'll definitely want those combined arms there. You also need to deal with vehicles as well, and also deal with fearless and high leadership units. So definitely make sure you're bringing enough big guns to the table to make sure that all your work doesn't go to waste when you just can't kill some of these tougher units. You can, of course, just pin them, but a lot of the time pin and tests do require you to force wounds through to make them happen, which again, if they're too tough, isn't going to work. So that's the episode. Thank you very much for listening. I really hope it's been interesting. I hope it's been of use. Hopefully there's lots of information there to get your creative juices flowing on how to build and use your Night Lord's force, and what tactics you might use and what units you might take to make that really fun and interesting on the tabletop. I do genuinely think it's a super fun and interesting force, because there's so much cool stuff that you have to do to make the army work. But I also think if you pull all those things off, I think the army is really powerful and really effective on the tabletop as well. Please do leave me a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and if there's anything you'd like to discuss in the episode or just like to leave some feedback, please do leave me a comment. To finish up, I'm going to leave you with a quote by Konrad Kurze, which I think pretty much sums up how he got to the position he ended up being in, because he was, let's face it, a little bit of a lunatic by the end. There can be no justice without fear, no fear without suffering. And certainly if you play Night Lords, I do think your opponents are going to suffer, but at least try to make it fun for them while they do. Bye bye.